You don't notice it at first. There's no dramatic moment, no fireworks, no big speech. It's subtle, quiet, almost invisible. One day, you just stop checking your phone every 5 minutes. You stop rereading old messages. You stop imagining what they're thinking. And without announcing it to the world, you begin to move on. And that's when something shifts. Because the moment you truly start letting go, that's when they feel it. That's when the avoidant makes their final desperate move. Let's be real for a second. When the breakup first happened, you probably chased, even if you didn't blow up their phone. You chased emotionally, you held space, you stayed available, you left the door cracked open. A part of you believed they would come back once they calmed down. And deep down, they knew that too. Avoidants have a strange comfort in knowing they can return whenever they want. As long as you're still emotionally there, they feel in control. It's like having a backup key to a house they walked out of. They may not use it, but knowing it's there keeps them calm. But something changes when you stop being emotionally available. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. You don't react the same way. Your energy feels different. You're not posting for them anymore. You're not responding instantly. You're not trying to decode their silence. And here's the part most people don't understand. Avoidants don't react to your words. They react to your withdrawal. They don't panic when you beg. They panic when you detach. When they first ended things, they likely felt relief, space, freedom, avoidance, associate intimacy with pressure. So distance feels safe. But here's the twist. They also assume you'll stay emotionally connected. They assume you'll be hurt. They assume you'll need time. They assume you won't move on quickly. That assumption is their safety net. As long as they believe you're still orbiting around them emotionally, they feel powerful. Now imagine what happens when that illusion cracks. When they sense, not through words but through energy, that you are no longer waiting. Maybe you stopped watching their stories. Maybe you stopped responding warmly. Maybe your posts look lighter, calmer, happier. Maybe you're going out more. Maybe you're just quieter. It doesn't matter what the signal is. What matters is that they feel a shift. And avoidants are incredibly sensitive to shifts in emotional availability. This is the moment everything starts to turn, because suddenly the dynamic isn't stable anymore. They're no longer the one choosing distance while you choose hope. Now it feels like you're choosing distance too, and that hits differently. That feels like loss. Understand this clearly. Avoidants are not emotionless. They are emotionally defensive. They suppress, they compartmentalize, they intellectualize, they convince themselves they're fine. But suppression is not absence. When they sense you moving on, their nervous system lights up. It's not always conscious at first. It's more like an internal discomfort, a subtle restlessness, a question they didn't expect to ask. What if they're really gone? Scarcity changes everything. The same person they felt suffocated by suddenly feels scarce. The same connection they downplayed now feels threatened. And the human brain reacts strongly to perceived loss, even avoidance, especially avoidance, because while they fear engulfment, they also fear abandonment. They just don't admit it easily. So what happens next? It doesn't start with a dramatic confession. It starts small, almost innocent. You'll notice the first subtle sign, sudden curiosity. They start watching everything you post. If they muted you before, they unmute you. If they unfollowed you, they peek. If they were distant, they're suddenly observing. It's like they're checking the temperature, gathering data, trying to confirm whether their fear is real. And then comes the casual reach out. A random message, something neutral. Hey, how have you been? Or a comment about something you posted. Or an inside joke from the past. It's never direct at first. It's calculated to look effortless. They don't want to appear affected. Avoidants hate looking emotionally exposed, so they disguise their anxiety as nonchalance. But make no mistake, this isn't random. This is the beginning of the final desperate move. Because what they're really asking isn't how are you, it's do I still have access to you? They're testing the door, seeing if it's still unlocked, seeing if you'll respond the same way you always did. Here's where your growth matters. If you respond exactly like before, excited, eager, overly available, their nervous system calms down, the threat disappears, they feel secure again, knowing you're still there. And once they feel secure, the urgency fades, they retreat, the cycle resets. But if you respond differently, everything changes. If your tone is calm, if you're polite but not emotionally leaning in, if you take your time, if you don't ask questions back immediately, If your energy feels grounded instead of attached, they feel it instantly. And that's when the ego shock hits. Because now it's not just a hypothetical fear, now it's evidence. You are not the same. You are not chasing. You are not orbiting. You are not emotionally waiting. And that realization hits the part of them they try so hard to silence, the part that fears being truly left behind. This is where it gets intense internally for them. Avoidants rely on emotional predictability. They expect distance to create longing in you, not independence. They expect silence to make you anxious, not empowered. So when the opposite happens, it disrupts their entire mental script. They may start replaying memories, wondering who you're talking to, questioning whether you've met someone new, not necessarily because they want commitment suddenly, but because they don't want to lose the option of you. That option was always comforting, and now it feels like it's expiring. And here's the truth that might empower you. You didn't create this shift by playing games. You created it by genuinely beginning to detach. That's the difference. Real detachment cannot be faked long term. Energy doesn't lie. When you truly begin pouring into yourself, focusing on your healing, rebuilding your life, your frequency changes. You're no longer vibrating at "please choose me." You're vibrating at "I choose myself." And that frequency shift is loud, even in silence. Avoidants are highly attuned to losing control of emotional dynamics. When they sense they're no longer the one holding the power, their behavior shifts. But it doesn't start with grand gestures. It starts with curiosity, observation, testing, because they need information before they escalate. Think about it like this. When they felt you were emotionally available, they could afford to be distant. Now that you seem unavailable, distance feels dangerous, and humans react strongly to danger, even emotional danger. The final desperate move doesn't come from confidence. It comes from fear. Fear of irreversible loss. Fear that this time you won't be there when they circle back. Fear that someone else will give you what they refuse to give. But here's what makes this powerful for you. This entire shift only happens when you actually start moving on. Not when you pretend, not when you post strategically to make them jealous, not when you send indirect signals. It happens when you stop centering your life around their potential return. When your healing becomes real, when your happiness isn't tied to their validation. And I know that's not easy. Moving on feels like giving up hope. It feels like closing a chapter you weren't ready to close. But ironically, it's that very act of self-respect that triggers their internal panic. Right now, if you're in this stage where they've started peeking back in after sensing your distance, understand something important. This is not random timing. This is psychology. This is attachment dynamics playing out exactly as they tend to when one person truly detaches. You are not crazy for noticing the pattern. You are not imagining the shift. When avoidants see you moving on, it activates something they can't ignore forever. And what starts as curiosity can quickly build into something much bigger. But before we even get to the dramatic part, before we talk about the intense confessions, the sudden urgency, the emotional vulnerability that seems to appear out of nowhere, you need to fully understand these first 5 stages. Because this foundation explains everything that follows. They felt safe when you were waiting. They felt in control when you were emotionally available. They assumed you would always be there. In the moment that assumption cracks, their nervous system reacts, first with observation, then with testing, then with subtle attempts to reestablish connection. And this is only the beginning, because when they realize you're not reacting the same way, when they truly believe you might be gone for good, that's when the final desperate move begins. And this is where everything escalates, because once they realize you're not reacting the same way, once they feel that your emotional door is no longer wide open, the testing phase turns into something much more intense. The curiosity shifts into strategy. The casual messages become more frequent. The tone changes. And this is the moment the final desperate move truly begins to form. At first, it might look like confidence. It might look like clarity, but underneath it, there's urgency. Because now they're not just checking if you're available, they're trying to pull you back. And the first way they often do that is through what feels like a sudden emotional shift. The same person who once struggled to express feelings now sounds deeper, softer, more reflective. They might say they've been thinking about you. They might admit they miss you. They might bring up memories you thought they barely valued. And it hits you hard, because this is the version of them you always wanted. The open one, the expressive one, the emotionally aware one. This is what feels like love bombing 2.0, but it's different from the beginning of the relationship. Back then, it was excitement, novelty, dopamine. Now it's fueled by fear of loss. The intensity feels stronger because it's reactive. They sense something slipping away, so they move fast. They compliment you more. They validate you more. They might even apologize in ways they never did before. And part of you wants to believe this is growth. Part of you wants to believe this is the breakthrough you were waiting for. And here's the complicated truth. Sometimes it is genuine, but sometimes it's panic disguised as transformation. And those two can look identical at first. When avoidants feel secure that you'll always stay, they don't feel pressure to change. There's no urgency. But when they sense you detaching, the fear of irreversible loss activates parts of them they've suppressed. Emotions they buried start surfacing. Regret creeps in. They begin romanticizing the connection, instead of focusing on the pressure it once triggered. The same closeness that once felt overwhelming now feels meaningful. Memory softens everything. They might start saying things like, I didn't realize what I had, or I've been doing a lot of thinking, or I was scared before. These words feel validating because they confirm what you always sensed, that there was depth beneath their distance. And you're not wrong. There usually was. Avoidants feel deeply. They just fear the vulnerability that comes with expressing it. But here's what you need to watch carefully. Real growth is consistent. Panic is urgent, but unstable. In this phase, they may suddenly want to see you, talk more, reconnect quickly. They might push for emotional closeness at a pace that feels shocking compared to their previous withdrawal. And your heart might race because this feels like the moment you waited for. This is where it becomes crucial to stay grounded. Because if nothing internally changed for them, if they haven't truly worked on their fear of intimacy, the cycle can restart the moment they feel secure again. Once they sense you're back emotionally, the urgency fades, the intensity cools, the distance slowly creeps back in, and you're left confused all over again. Now let's talk about another move that often appears in this stage: jealousy tactics and subtle competition. When avoidants see you moving on, especially if there's even a hint that someone else might be entering your life, something primal activates. It's not always about love. In that moment, it's about attachment and ego. They don't want to feel replaceable. They don't want to imagine someone else giving you what they refuse to give. So they may start posting strategically, highlighting their social life, mentioning new connections, dropping subtle hints about people who are interested in them. It's not random. It's emotional positioning. They want to see if you react. They want reassurance that you still care. Because if you don't react, that silence becomes louder than any confrontation ever could. And here's the irony. The more grounded you are, the more unsettled they may become. Because your calm signals strength, your lack of reaction signals independence. And independence feels threatening to someone who relied on emotional control to feel safe. Then comes something even more surprising. The person who once avoided labels, avoided deep talks about the future, avoided defining the relationship, suddenly wants clarity. Suddenly they're asking what you are to each other. Suddenly they're talking about commitment in ways they resisted before. And you might think, why now? The answer is simple but uncomfortable, because now it feels like they could lose you. Commitment becomes appealing when the alternative is permanent loss. When they thought you'd always be there, they didn't feel pressure to step up. But now, the idea of you choosing someone else makes commitment feel urgent instead of suffocating. And this is where your emotional strength is tested the most, because it feels validating. It feels like you finally matter enough for them to fight. It feels like proof that you weren't asking for too much all along. But remember, urgency is not the same as stability. Fear-driven commitment can crumble once the fear subsides. As the stage deepens, something even more vulnerable can happen. Emotional confessions they suppressed may start pouring out. They may admit they were scared of losing themselves. They may confess they pushed you away because things felt too real. They may finally validate the pain you experienced during the breakup, and hearing that can feel healing. It can feel like closure, or it can feel like hope reigniting. Avoidants often don't process emotions until distance forces them to. When you were close, vulnerability felt risky. When you're walking away, vulnerability feels necessary. Loss creates access to emotions they blocked before. That's why these confessions often appear only when you truly detach. But here's the key that changes everything. This only happens when your detachment is real, not strategic, not performative. Real. When you genuinely start building a life that doesn't revolve around their return, your energy shifts in a way that cannot be faked. And that shift is what flips the internal switch in them. If you're still secretly waiting, they sense it. If you're still emotionally hooked, they feel the tether and they relax. But when the tether snaps, when you emotionally release them, that's when the panic begins. And I need you to hear this clearly. The goal was never to make them desperate. The goal was to heal. The shift in power isn't about revenge. It's about alignment. When you stop chasing someone who is unsure about you, you step into a different position entirely. You move from being chosen to choosing, and that energy changes how people respond to you. Right now, if they're making these sudden moves, if they're more expressive, more urgent, more reactive, don't let the intensity blind you. Observe consistency. Watch behavior over time. Notice whether the vulnerability continues once you don't immediately fall back into old patterns. Because the dangerous trap here is restarting the cycle. Closeness, comfort, security, withdrawal, distance, panic, return. If nothing foundational shifted, the pattern repeats. And every repetition hurts deeper because hope gets harder to rebuild. But there's another possibility too. Sometimes real loss wakes people up. Sometimes detachment forces self-reflection. Sometimes fear of losing something meaningful pushes someone to confront their avoidance patterns. The difference lies in action over time. Growth isn't loud, it's steady. It shows up in consistency, accountability, and sustained emotional availability. You're standing at a powerful crossroads right now. The energy has shifted. They feel it. You feel it. The dynamic isn't what it used to be. And for the first time, you're not reacting from fear of losing them. You're observing. You're grounded. You're aware. And that awareness is your power, because whether they truly change or not, you've already begun changing. You've stepped out of the chasing role. You've reclaimed your emotional center. And that alone alters the entire story. The final desperate move isn't just about what they do next. It's about who you are when they do it. Are you still seeking validation? Or are you evaluating alignment? Are you reacting emotionally or responding intentionally? Because the truth is, when an avoidant sees you moving on, it shakes something deep inside them. It challenges their assumptions. It forces them to confront the possibility of permanent loss. And what they do in response can look dramatic, intense, even romantic. But your job now isn't to be swept away by intensity, it's to stay steady in your worth. And what comes next? The deeper psychological reason behind their fear and how to tell whether this is real transformation or temporary panic is where everything becomes crystal clear. And this is where we go deeper, because now we're not just talking about behavior. We're talking about the psychology underneath it, the part that doesn't show on social media, the part they don't say out loud. The part that explains why someone who seems so detached can suddenly look terrified of losing you. At the core of avoidant attachment is a contradiction most people don't see. They fear engulfment. Yes, they fear losing independence. They fear being emotionally overwhelmed. But at the exact same time, they also fear abandonment. They just suppress that side harder. When closeness feels intense, they deactivate. They convince themselves they don't need anyone. They focus on flaws. They create distance. That distance feels like control. But when you move on for real, that control disappears. And what replaces it is something much more primal, the fear of irreversible loss. Not temporary distance, not a short break, permanent loss. And permanent loss activates attachment anxiety, even in someone who avoids closeness. Because attachment isn't optional, it's wired into the nervous system. When they believed you were still emotionally tethered, their system was calm. Even if they weren't reaching out, even if they were cold, they had a silent reassurance that you were still there. You were still an option. Now that option feels like it's slipping away. And the human brain reacts strongly when something valuable feels scarce. It amplifies importance. It intensifies desire. It rewrites memories. That's why they may suddenly start remembering the good more than the conflict. They replay laughter, comfort, intimacy, the way you supported them, the way you understood them, the way you stayed when things got hard. And the more they imagine you giving that to someone else, the more their chest tightens, because now it's not about pressure, it's about replacement. And replacement is what shakes avoidants the most, not because they necessarily want immediate commitment, but because they don't want to be replaced in your emotional world. They don't want to lose significance. They don't want to become a chapter you've closed for good. So here's where you need clarity. When they come back intense, emotional, expressive, you have to ask yourself one grounded question. Is this fear-based urgency or long-term transformation? Because those two feel almost identical in the beginning. Both involve vulnerability, both involve apologies, both involve effort. The difference shows up in time and consistency. Fear-based reactions are loud but short-lived. They spike, they feel dramatic, they feel passionate. But once they sense you leaning back in, once they feel safe again, that you're not going anywhere, their nervous system calms down. And when it calms down, old patterns can quietly return. Less communication, less emotional depth, more space, more avoidance. Real change, on the other hand, feels steady. It doesn't demand immediate reconciliation. It doesn't pressure you to decide quickly. It shows up as consistent behavior, as accountability, as a willingness to sit in uncomfortable conversations instead of shutting down. And this is where many people fall into the dangerous trap, because when someone who once withheld emotion suddenly floods you with it, it feels intoxicating, it feels validating, it feels like justice, like finally being seen. But if you rush back in without observing stability, you risk restarting the same cycle that broke you the first time. Closeness builds, they feel secure. The urgency fades, the avoidance slowly reactivates. They begin to feel pressure again. They pull away, you feel confused. The pattern repeats, and each time it repeats, it chips away at your emotional trust. Not just in them, but in yourself. This is why the power position you're in right now is so important. When you've genuinely started moving on, you're not negotiating from fear anymore. You're not trying to convince someone to choose you. You're evaluating whether they align with you. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic. Before, you may have felt like you were waiting to be picked. Now you're deciding whether they even qualify. That energy difference is massive, and they feel it. When you stop chasing, when you stop over-explaining, when you stop trying to prove your worth, something profound happens. You become emotionally grounded, and grounded energy is incredibly attractive because it signals self-respect. You're no longer reacting to their every move. You're observing. You're calm, you're centered, and ironically, that calmness can make them more anxious because they can't predict you anymore. You're not responding from the old script. You're not chasing reassurance. You're not trying to fix the distance. You're simply living, growing, moving, and that unpredictability makes them question their assumptions. But here's the deeper truth. The real win was never making them desperate. The real win was becoming untouchable in your self-worth. Untouchable doesn't mean cold. It doesn't mean bitter. It means your emotional stability doesn't depend on their presence. It means you can love someone without losing yourself. It means you can walk away from inconsistency without collapsing. If they are truly changing, they will meet you at this level. They will respect your boundaries. They will understand that trust has to be rebuilt slowly. They will accept that you need time to see consistency, and they won't punish you for it. If they're reacting from panic, you'll feel pressure. Pressure to decide quickly. Pressure to forgive instantly, pressure to jump back into intensity, and pressure is always a sign that the foundation hasn't shifted. Right now, you're in a position many people never reach. You've experienced the pain, you've experienced the confusion, and instead of staying stuck, you started moving forward. That movement is what triggered everything. Not manipulation, not games, growth. And growth changes relationship dynamics more than anything else. When one person evolves, the old pattern can't survive unchanged. It either upgrades or it breaks permanently. So what do you do when the final desperate move fully unfolds? You don't react emotionally. You respond intentionally. You slow the pace down. You observe actions more than words. You maintain your routines, your healing, your independence. You don't abandon yourself just because they're suddenly afraid to lose you. Because here's something powerful. The version of you that triggered their panic is the version that stopped centering them. Don't abandon that version now. If reconciliation happens, it should happen from strength, not fear. From clarity, not loneliness. From mutual growth, not emotional urgency. And if it doesn't happen, you still win, because you didn't stay stuck waiting for someone to decide your value. Sometimes the final desperate move is dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle. but its root is the same. They see you moving on and realize they no longer control the narrative. They no longer control access. They no longer control the emotional dynamic, and that realization forces them to confront their own attachment wounds. Whether they rise to meet that confrontation or retreat from it tells you everything you need to know. You don't need to chase clarity anymore. You don't need to decode mixed signals. When someone truly fears losing you and has done the internal work to change, their effort will feel steady, safe, consistent, not chaotic, not rushed, not reactive. And if you're listening to this while your heart is still tender, still hoping, still unsure, let this ground you. You are not powerful because they're panicking. You are powerful because you chose yourself. You are powerful because you stopped begging for what should have been freely given. You are powerful because you're willing to walk away from inconsistency, even if love is still there. That is emotional maturity. That is growth. That is strength. The final desperate move isn't the end of the story. It's the test. Not of their love, but of your self-respect. And how you respond to it will determine whether the next chapter is a repetition of the past or a completely different level of connection. And this is the part no one really talks about. After the intensity, after the confessions, after the urgency, after the promises, there's a quiet space where reality settles in. And in that quiet space, you find out what this was really about. Because once the final desperate move is made, once they've expressed fear, vulnerability, maybe even love, in a way they never did before, something has to happen next. Either the dynamic upgrades or it collapses back into its old shape. There is no neutral. Growth changes patterns permanently. Panic only disrupts them temporarily. This is where the dangerous trap can reappear. You feel validated. You feel chosen. You feel like the fight was worth it. And there's nothing wrong with wanting reconciliation. There's nothing weak about still loving someone. But here's the question that matters more than love. Has the foundation changed? Because if the foundation hasn't changed, the cycle will restart. And cycles are sneaky. They don't restart loudly. They restart subtly. At first, everything feels different. They text more. They check in. They're affectionate. They reassure you. You exhale. You think, finally, this is what it was supposed to be. But then, slowly, once they feel secure again, once they believe you're emotionally anchored back to them, something shifts, the urgency fades, the intensity lowers, they start needing more space again, conversations become less deep, they become slightly harder to reach, not dramatically, just enough for you to feel that familiar tightening in your chest, and you hate that feeling because you felt it before. That slow emotional drift, that subtle withdrawal, that quiet return of avoidance, and now you're stuck in the worst emotional place because this time you let yourself hope again. This is why emotional awareness is everything. When the final desperate move happens, your power is in pacing. You don't match intensity with intensity. You match it with stability. You slow things down. You observe consistency over weeks, not days. You let actions prove transformation. Real change doesn't demand instant trust. It understands rebuilding takes time. It welcomes accountability instead of resisting it. It doesn't get defensive when you express concerns. It doesn't disappear when conversations get uncomfortable. It leans in, even when it's hard. And if you notice defensiveness returning or emotional walls rebuilding the moment, pressure fades. That tells you this wasn't transformation. It was fear of loss. Now, here's something even deeper. When you truly detach, something inside you shifts permanently. Even if they come back, even if things restart, you're not the same version of yourself anymore. You've tasted independence. You've survived distance. You've proven to yourself that you can exist without them. And that internal shift changes how you show up. You're less tolerant of inconsistency, less willing to over-explain, less willing to chase. You communicate more clearly, you hold boundaries more calmly, and that alone makes the relationship dynamic different. Because now, if avoidance starts creeping back in, you notice faster. You address it sooner. You don't sit in confusion as long. And here's the truth that might sting, but will set you free. Sometimes the final desperate move isn't meant to bring you back together forever. Sometimes it's meant to give you closure. Sometimes it's meant to validate that you mattered, that they did feel it, that you weren't imagining the connection. That validation can heal something inside you, because one of the hardest parts of loving an avoidant is questioning whether it was real, When they withdraw, when they seem cold, when they minimize emotions, you start doubting your own experience. But when they panic at the thought of losing you, it reveals something powerful. It reveals that you are significant, that your presence mattered, that your absence hurts. And sometimes that knowledge alone is enough to let go peacefully. Now, let's talk about the power position you're standing in. This is not about ego. It's about clarity. When you're the one moving on, when you're the one emotionally grounded, you're no longer reacting from fear of abandonment. You're choosing based on alignment. And that changes everything. You're not asking, do they want me? You're asking, are they capable of loving me in the way I need? That question flips the entire script. It moves you from seeking validation to evaluating compatibility. When someone sees you in that position, calm, self-assured, unattached to outcome, it forces them to confront their own emotional maturity. They either rise to meet it or shrink away from it. There is no in-between. If they rise, you'll see it in consistency. You'll see it in effort that doesn't fade after reassurance. You'll see it in difficult conversations, handled with patience. You'll see it in reliability. You'll see it in emotional availability, sustained over time. If they shrink, you'll see old patterns resurface. Excuses, delays, emotional distancing disguised as busyness. And this time, instead of chasing, you'll simply observe, and you'll decide accordingly. Because the real win here was never getting them to panic. The real win was becoming someone who doesn't need someone else's panic to feel valued. Let that sink in. You are not powerful because they're desperate. You are powerful because you're detached from the outcome. You're okay whether they step up or step away. That emotional neutrality is strength, it's freedom. And here's the final layer of this stage. Sometimes when avoidants make their final desperate move and realize you're truly steady, truly grounded, truly unwilling to collapse back into old dynamics, something shifts in them permanently because they can no longer rely on avoidance as a defense. They're forced to confront their fear directly. That confrontation is uncomfortable. It requires introspection. It requires vulnerability. It requires growth. And growth is slow. It's not dramatic. It's not flashy. It's daily effort. It's consistent emotional presence. If they choose that path, it won't feel chaotic. It will feel calm. And calm love feels different than intense love. It feels stable, predictable, safe. It doesn't spike your anxiety. It doesn't make you question your worth. It doesn't keep you guessing. But if they don't choose growth, if they retreat once urgency fades, you won't crumble this time because you've already proven you can move forward. You've already broken the attachment loop once. You can do it again and faster. This entire journey was never just about them. It was about you discovering your emotional resilience. It was about you realizing that love should not feel like constant uncertainty. It was about you understanding that being chosen late is not the same as being valued consistently. The final desperate move is dramatic. It shakes things up. It can reopen doors you thought were closed, but what you do next defines the ending. Not their fear, not their urgency, your standards, your boundaries, your self-respect. And maybe the most powerful realization of all is this: when you genuinely move on, you don't need them to panic. You don't need them to confess. You don't need them to compete because you've already reclaimed your peace. And peace is the one thing avoidant dynamics can't survive without transformation. Either the relationship evolves to protect your peace, or you walk away to preserve it. That's the level you're stepping into now. Not reactive, not desperate, not chasing, choosing, calm, grounded. And from this place, whether they stay or go, you win.